He thought he'd buried me with her. I suppose I understand why. I'm 67 years old. I walk with a slight limp from a job site accident back in 1998. My hair went white before my daughter was out of middle school, and I have the kind of face that people look at and assume has already seen its best days. When my son-in-law watched me load 2 garbage bags of clothes into Frank's pickup truck that Tuesday morning in January, standing on the porch of the house my daughter and I had picked out together, he had the expression of a man watching a problem solve itself. He crossed his arms. He didn't say goodbye. He just watched me go, and I could feel his relief from 40 feet away. What Derek didn't know, what I had spent the previous 9 months making absolutely certain he would never know until it was too late, was that I am a retired structural engineer with 38 years of experience designing systems that hold weight other people never even think about. I know how to build things that don't collapse when pressure is applied. I know exactly where to put the load-bearing walls, and I had built something around my daughter's estate that Derek would spend the rest of his life trying to break through. He never would. My name is Arthur Benson. I spent my career with the Army Corps of Engineers, and then 22 years running my own civil engineering firm in Portland, Oregon. I retired at 63, sold the firm for a number that surprised even me, and moved into a smaller house on the eastern edge of Willamette Valley wine country, close enough to my daughter Claire that I could be there in 20 minutes if she needed me. Claire was 34 when she married Derek Holt. She was smart and warm and had her mother's eyes and her mother's stubborn streak, and she had chosen a career in environmental law that made me prouder than I could ever properly say. Derek was 38, good-looking in a way that photographs well, and worked in commercial real estate development. He talked about projects the way some men talk about sports constantly, in the vocabulary of someone who wanted you to know how much money was involved. He was not a bad man when I first met him, or if he was, he hid it well enough that Claire didn't see it, and Claire was not a woman who missed much. They were married in September of 2018. I gave a toast. I danced badly. I cried in the bathroom for a few minutes, thinking about her mother, who had passed 8 years before and would have given anything to be there. It was, by every measure, a good day. The first 2 years were fine. Claire continued her legal work. Derek closed a few deals, grew more comfortable spending at a level that made me quietly uneasy, but wasn't my business. They bought a house in the hills outside Portland, a beautiful property on 4 acres, and I helped them with the down payment because Claire asked me to, and because I could. I didn't think much of it at the time. Parents help their children. That is what you do. Claire was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March of 2021. I need you to understand what that diagnosis sounds like when a doctor delivers it to the father of a 36-year-old woman. I have heard a lot of difficult things in my life. I have been on job sites where men were hurt. I have stood at a graveside and watched them lower my wife into the ground. Nothing sounds like that. The room goes very quiet in a way that has nothing to do with sound. She called me herself the same afternoon. Her voice was steady. Claire was always the steadiest person in any room she was in. She told me the stage. She told me what the doctors had said about treatment options. She told me she was scared, but that she wanted to fight it. And then she said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about some things. Not medical things. Other things. Can you come over this weekend?" I was in my car before she finished the sentence. That weekend conversation was the first of many. Over the following months, as Claire moved through her treatments, chemotherapy, a surgical consult that ultimately didn't go forward, more chemotherapy, she and I talked. Seriously, about what she had, what she wanted to protect, where she wanted it to go. She was an environmental lawyer. She understood trusts. She understood estate structures. She understood what happened to assets when a marriage ended or when a person died. She had seen it play out in other families in her legal work. She had thought about it carefully, and she had concerns about Derek. She didn't say it in those terms, not at first. She said she wanted to make sure her charitable foundation was protected. She said she wanted to make sure her stake in a small timber conservation company she had co-founded, a company that by 2021 had grown to hold assets and timber rights worth approximately $41 million, would be used the way she intended. She said she wanted to make sure certain things were handled correctly, but over time, as her health fluctuated and the treatments took their toll, and she lay in the guest room we had set up so I could stay over on the harder days, she was more direct. "Derek has changed," she said to me one evening in August. The light was coming through the curtains at a low angle, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with that particular day. I don't know if it's the diagnosis, or if this is who he was all along, and I'm only seeing it now. But he has changed. I asked her what she meant. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He asked me last week what happens to the timber company shares if I die. He wasn't asking because he was worried about me. I know what that question sounds like when someone is worried about the person. That wasn't what that was." I stayed very still. "I'm not going to make it dramatic," she said. "I don't know what he's capable of. Maybe nothing. Maybe I'm not thinking clearly, but I want everything protected. Everything I've built. Everything that matters to me. I want it protected. Will you help me do that?" I told her I would. I told her we would start on Monday, and I meant both things completely. We found a trust and estates attorney named Raymond Caldwell, whom Claire had known professionally, and Taras did, absolutely. Over the following 6 months between treatments, on better days, by phone and email, on worse ones, we built something. An irrevocable charitable remainder trust that held her shares in the timber company. A separate family trust that held the property interests she had inherited from her mother's side. Specific directives about the house, which was titled in both her and Derek's names, but with provisions triggered by certain conditions that Raymond drafted with the quiet precision of someone who had seen every variety of bad behavior a grieving spouse could produce. Claire signed everything with full legal capacity, witnessed, notarized, documented. She wrote letters. She recorded a video statement on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting up in the guest room chair, wearing her favorite blue sweater, saying clearly, and in her own words, exactly what she intended and why. Raymond kept copies. I kept copies. A fireproof lockbox in my house held copies. Derek knew nothing about any of it. I want to be precise about this because I know how it sounds. We were not trying to deceive him in any illegal or improper way. Claire was entitled to structure her estate however she chose. Raymond made sure every document was airtight. What we were doing was making sure that the structures were in place before they could be interfered with, because Claire had told me quietly and clearly that she did not trust that her husband would allow her wishes to be honored if he knew what they were in advance. She was right. I didn't know how right until after she was gone. Claire died on a Saturday morning in November. The day was gray and cold, the kind of Oregon November that makes you feel the year is closing a door. I was there. I held her hand. Derek was in the house. He came in near the end, stood at the foot of the bed, said the things people say. I don't doubt he felt something. I just don't know what. I stayed for the following week. I cooked meals neither of us ate. I made phone calls. I handled what needed handling, because that is what I have always done in crisis, and because sitting still felt impossible. Derek was present but distant, moving through the house like a man calculating something. On the 9th day, He asked me to leave. He was not aggressive about it. I'll give him that. He knocked on the guest room door on a Sunday evening, came in, and stood with his hands in his pockets, and said that he thought it was time for me to start getting back to my own routine. That staying in the house wasn't healthy for either of us. That he appreciated everything I'd done, but that he needed space to figure out what came next. He said all of this in the tone of a reasonable person. Every word was engineered. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I said, "Of course, I'll be out tomorrow morning." He looked almost disappointed that I didn't argue. I think he had a speech prepared. I want to explain why I left the way I did, because this is the part that I've thought about most, the part people might not immediately understand. I left without a fight, and without taking anything beyond my personal clothes and toiletries for a deliberate reason. The house contained items that Claire had specifically listed in her trust documents: artwork, furniture pieces, her grandmother's jewelry, personal papers. If I had taken them, Derek could have argued I had removed assets from the estate before it was properly administered. By leaving them in place, by leaving without any confrontation, I gave him rope. I left the stage exactly as it was, and I let him walk out onto it. Frank picked me up at 7 o'clock in the morning. He's been my closest friend since we were both young engineers on the same federal project in the mid-'80s, and he had known Claire since she was 9 years old. He didn't say much during the drive. He didn't need to. He had a spare room, and I stayed there. Derek moved fast. I'll credit him with that. Within 2 weeks of Claire's death, he had contacted a business attorney, not Raymond, not anyone who knew the actual structure of Claire's estate, and begun the process of trying to establish his claim to her assets. He engaged a financial advisory firm. He reached out to the timber company to discuss, as he put it in a letter. Their board later shared with me, transitional ownership matters. The timber company's attorney called Raymond. Raymond called me. Raymond said, in the dry tone of a man who has seen this particular movie many times, "It's beginning." The first wall Derek hit was the timber company shares. He had assumed, operating on whatever Claire might have told him generally about her work, that as her surviving spouse, he would inherit her ownership stake. What he found instead was that the shares were held, not in Claire's name, in the name of an irrevocable trust, a trust she had established and funded 9 months before her death, with a board of trustees that did not include her husband, directed towards specific conservation and charitable purposes. With a legal structure that his attorney looked at, and apparently spent a long time being very quiet about, he could not touch it. He then moved to the separate family property trust, real estate holdings that had come from my wife's family, that Claire had always understood as hers to steward. He found those equally inaccessible, structured so that any attempt to claim them as marital assets would require proving they were transmuted, commingled with marital funds, and Raymond had been meticulous about keeping the accounting clean. He could not touch those either. What he did have was the house, half of it, as a surviving spouse in a jointly titled property. But even there, Raymond had worked quietly. There was a recorded agreement signed by Claire months before she died, establishing my right of first refusal to purchase her half at appraised value before any sale could proceed to a third party. It didn't mean Derek couldn't eventually get his equity out. It meant he couldn't simply sell the house out from under Claire's estate without going through a process that would take time, cost money, and require him to deal with me. He could not move quickly on anything. I heard through the attorney network Raymond knew people, and in legal communities word travels that Derek's initial consultations were producing results he had not anticipated. His original attorney apparently concluded that the estate structure was comprehensive enough that aggressive litigation had a poor probability of success. which is attorney language. For you are going to lose and spend a lot of money losing. Derek went and found a second attorney. The second attorney reached a similar conclusion with an additional observation. Some of the financial transactions Derek had attempted to initiate, certain transfers he had made from a joint account in the weeks immediately following Claire's death before the estate was formally administered, might themselves warrant scrutiny. That was when things shifted in a direction I had not fully anticipated. I should explain what Derek had actually done with the joint account. In the 2 weeks after Claire died, before probate had properly begun, he had moved a significant sum, eventually established at just over $300,000 out of accounts that should have been frozen pending estate administration. He had done this believing, I think, that with everything else he assumed he was about to inherit, no one would look too carefully at the details. It is the kind of mistake that people make when they believe they have won comprehensively. They stop watching the small things. Raymond flagged it. I authorized him to pursue it. A report went to the Oregon State Bar's Financial Oversight Division, and a separate civil claim was filed as part of the estate administration process. Derek did not know when he had stood on the porch watching me leave with my 2 garbage bags that I had a copy of every bank statement, every account number, every financial document from the joint accounts, because Clara and I had, in those careful months of preparation, made copies of everything and kept them with Raymond. We had not taken anything from the accounts. We had simply documented what was there. Documentation is a quiet form of power. Most people underestimate it. I was staying in Frank's guest room when Raymond called me on a Friday afternoon in late February, about 6 weeks after Clara's death. He said that Derek's second attorney had made contact, wanting to discuss a possible resolution. He said the tone had changed considerably. He said the words "possible resolution" the way a man says them when he means the other side is looking for a door. I asked Raymond to tell them I was not available to discuss any resolution at this time, that the estate administration would proceed according to the documents as filed, and that any further communication should go through him. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You sure?" And I said, "Completely." 3 days later, Derek called my cell phone directly. I don't know how he got the number, possibly from something in Claire's phone, possibly from a mutual acquaintance. I let it go to voicemail. The message was careful, almost formal. He said he felt we had gotten off on the wrong foot, that he'd been grieving and not thinking clearly, that he hoped we could talk. His voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness, there was something else. Something I recognized. It was the sound of a man who had run the calculations and found the numbers didn't add up the way he thought they would. I did not call him back. The following 2 weeks involved a significant amount of legal activity that I will not detail fully here, because it is still partially subject to ongoing proceedings. But the short version is this. The estate administration revealed the account transfers, which triggered a formal civil claim. Derek's attorneys, now on their 3rd firm, determined that fighting both the estate structure and the civil claim simultaneously was not a viable strategy. The Timber Company Trust was unassailable. The Family Property Trust was unassailable. The house required negotiation, not litigation. And the account transfers were a wound he had made himself. He had walked into a house he thought was empty and found every room locked. I was at Raymond's office on a Tuesday morning in early March when the call came in from Derek's attorney requesting a settlement conference. Raymond had laid out the documents on the conference table, the trust agreements, the notarized letters, the video statement Claire had recorded in her blue sweater on that gray November afternoon 9 months before she died. He had arranged them in a particular order. He said the arrangement was intentional. He said, "When they see all of this together, I want them to understand what she built." I sat in that conference room, and I thought about Claire picking out the timber acreage for her conservation project, the way her face looked when she talked about old-growth watershed corridors and what it meant to protect them. I thought about her at 9 years old, teaching herself to identify tree species from a field guide she'd found at a library sale. I thought about her mother's eyes. The settlement conference happened 10 days later. I was not required to attend, and Raymond advised me not to. I stayed at Frank's house, and Frank made coffee, and we didn't talk much. Raymond called me at 2:17 in the afternoon. He said, "It's done." The terms, which Raymond walked me through on the phone, were essentially this. Derek would receive his share of the equity from the house to be paid out following an appraisal and my exercise of right of first refusal, which meant I would buy Claire's half at appraised value, and Derek would receive his proportionate share of what had been his and Claire's joint equity, minus the amount owed back to the estate for the unauthorized account transfers. The Timber Company Trust and the Family Property Trust were untouched as they had always been, held for their charitable and conservation purposes as Claire had intended. Derek walked away with significantly less than he had believed he would receive, and with a settlement agreement that included specific language acknowledging his obligation to the estate, language his attorney had negotiated hard to soften, but had not been able to eliminate entirely. He also walked away with a professional reputation that had been quietly and thoroughly damaged in the community where he worked. Commercial real estate in the Portland metropolitan area is a smaller world than it appears from the outside. People talk. Attorneys talk, especially. I did not participate in any of this spreading of information. I didn't need to. The proceedings were a matter of record. People who worked with Derek, or were considering working with Derek, could find what they needed to find. The house closed in April. I bought Claire's half. I now own it jointly with her estate trust, which means in practical terms, I own it. I hold it. I maintain it. I walk through it sometimes on weekend afternoons, and I look at the things she chose, and I let myself feel what needs to be felt. The Timber Company continues its conservation work under the board she selected. The watershed corridors she cared about are being protected. The foundation she established has funded 3 research partnerships with Oregon State University. Her name is on things that will outlast all of us. I moved back into the house in May. I planted the back garden area that Claire had always talked about putting in, but never had the time for vegetables mostly. Some flowers along the fence line, because she would have wanted flowers. Frank comes by on Sunday afternoons, and we drink coffee on the back porch and talk about nothing in particular, in the way that old friends do. I think about Derek sometimes, not with hatred. I want to be honest about that, because hatred is heavy, and I am 67 years old, and I have no interest in carrying it. I think about him with something closer to clarity. He made a calculation. He looked at an old man with a limp and 2 garbage bags, and assumed the math was straightforward. He had not accounted for the 9 months of conversations in a guest room. He had not accounted for an irrevocable trust. He had not accounted for a structural engineer who has spent 4 decades thinking about load-bearing systems. He had not accounted for Claire. That is the thing I want to say most clearly. The thing I come back to when I sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the light change over the valley. Everything that Derek found locked when he went looking, every wall, every door, every legal provision he ran up against Claire built, not me. I helped. Raymond helped. But the vision of it, the determination to build it, the clarity about what mattered and what needed protecting, that was my daughter. sitting in that guest room chair in her blue sweater, sick and tired and 36 years old, making decisions about watershed corridors and charitable foundations and right of first refusal agreements, planning not for her own future, but for the future of the things she loved. She was the best structural engineer in the room. She always was. I finished the garden in early June. On the last afternoon, I went inside and found the framed photograph that sits on the mantel Claire at maybe 12, holding that battered tree identification guide, squinting into the sun somewhere in the Coast Range, absolutely certain she was right about whatever species she was looking at. I stood there for a while. I let myself feel it. Then I went back outside, and I watered the flowers along the fence line. And I thought about how she would have had opinions about which varieties I'd chosen, and how she would have been right, and how I would have let her be right, and how that is the particular gift of loving someone who is smarter than you. The day was clear. The valley stretched out below the property in every direction. The timberlands she had spent her career protecting were visible on the hillsides to the west, deep, green, and solid, carrying weight she had spent her life building the structures to hold. She thought she had won, the woman in the other story. In mine, it was a man who thought the same thing. He stood on a porch with his arms crossed and watched me drive away and believed the equation was settled. But Claire had been building the answer for 9 months before the question was even asked. Derek thought he had everything. He had the house, the name on the accounts, the assumption that grief makes people passive and age makes people tractable, and that a 67-year-old man with a limp is a problem that solves itself. He had none of it. He never did. It was never really there. What was there, what has always been there, what will be there long after Derek Holt has faded entirely from any story anyone tells, is a conservation easement on 11,000 acres of Pacific Northwest watershed held in permanent trust, generating research and protection, and the slow, patient work of keeping a forest standing. It is there because a young woman with her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness decided on a gray March afternoon when a doctor told her something terrible, that what mattered most was not what she could keep, but what she could protect. I go out in the morning sometimes, and I just stand at the edge of the property and look west toward the hills. Frank thinks I'm being dramatic. Maybe I am. I'm 67. I've earned a certain amount of drama. There are mornings when the light comes through the Douglas firs at a particular angle, and the whole ridge seems to breathe. And in those moments, I do not feel like a man who won something. I feel like a man who was trusted by someone remarkable to hold something she loved, and who did not let her down. That is enough. That is more than enough. I tried more than once to tell Claire during those long months of planning that I didn't need to be protected, that whatever happened after she was gone would be survivable, that she shouldn't spend her energy on anything other than getting better. She would look at me with that steady expression of hers, the one she'd had since she was small, the one that meant she was about to be very patient with someone she loved who was saying something incorrect, and she would say, "Dad, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for the trees." I laughed every time. I couldn't help it. She was right, of course. She was right about practically everything. The trees are still standing. The foundation is funded and operational. The watershed corridors she spent her career defending are defended, and I'm still here, which I think she would consider a satisfactory outcome, even if she'd never admit that the part about me was the main point. I am going to be here for a while yet. I have a garden to maintain, and a Sunday afternoon standing obligation with Frank, and a foundation board that needs someone who will ask uncomfortable questions at meetings. I have things to do. Claire made sure of it. He thought he'd buried me with her. He was wrong about that.